Hi, I'm Matt Kousinen from Ellis & Associates Wealth Management. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our fourth webinar on planning strategies for volatile markets. I will be moderating today's session and William Ellis will be our presenter. This episode will be the same length as previous episodes and we should be on the call for about 20 minutes. Please type any questions you have in the chat box during the session and we will address them in the time allotted at the end. As usual, the webinar is being recorded and we will send you a link afterwards so you can view anything you missed or to pass along to someone who might benefit from listening. We will also post on our website where you can view it anytime. You can also view our first 3 webinars there in our content library. Our session today has 4 sections. The first is a look at life expectancy in retirement. The second is a recap of inflation. The third is a question we work with clients to determine: how much should you spend in retirement? And finally, in the last section, William gives his insight into living life in retirement on your terms. So now on your screens is a graph we love because of the clear picture it gives on how long you, your spouse, or both of you may live in retirement. William, can you take us through this graph?
Sure, Matt. The graph plots the mortality table of Canadians age 65. It helps us to understand how long we might live. Males are represented by the black line, and females are represented by the orange line. The black line plots below the orange line, indicating that men on average predecease women. The graph answers how many 65-year-olds will live at least 20 years to age 85. If we follow the black and orange lines down to age 85, you see that just under half the men and just over half the women age 65 are expected to live to age 85. This may not be your particular situation. For those where it applies, it's instructive that the light blue line, which plots above both the black and orange line, plots for a male and female couple, both age 65, what the chance that one or the other of them will still be living at some point in the future. So while there's a 50% chance, give or take, of a male or a female single living to age 85, the light blue line indicates that for a couple, there is an 80% chance that at least one of the couple will be living at age 85. If we push the age out to 90, we see that the light blue line indicates that at least one of the couple living to age 90 is a 50% chance. That means for a couple retiring at age 65, there's a 50% chance that the income and assets need to last longer than 25 years into retirement. And if we extrapolate that and consider those retiring earlier than 65, say at age 60, there is close to a 50% chance of the income and assets needed for those early retirees to last longer than 30 years into retirement. For early retiree couples blessed with good genes and focused on looking after their health, a retirement of 35, maybe even 40 years is conceivable. To summarize, for couples age 65, there is approximately a 50% chance of one of the couple living to age 90. And if we go all the way out to 100, there's a modest 5% chance of one of the couple living to 100. So a 25-year retirement is likely, and a 30 to even 40-year retirement is possible. This begs the question, will your money last?
So William, in our last webinar, What's Your Number?, we examined the impact of inflation and the historical rates. Can you quickly give us a recap on this and your experience with inflation and maybe where you see it headed?
Well, Matt, in the 70s, inflation raged, with inflation above 10% some years. In the 80s, central banks fought and eventually slew the inflation dragon. And for the last 30 plus years, we've reaped the benefit of winning the battle and have enjoyed low and stable rates averaging 2% a year for inflation. And with inflation currently between 1 to 2% here in Canada, it's easy to get complacent and forget that the 40-year average for inflation is 4.5%. My concern is that there's a coordinated effort by central banks and governments around the world to get the economy moving, and that a byproduct could be an uptick in inflation. There are 3 levers governments have to cope with fiscal budgetary deficits. We've talked about these before. First, raise taxes. Second, cut entitlement spending. And third, indirectly tax consumers and investors by inflating prices, and as a direct result, deflate or devalue the real value of outstanding government debt. I suspect that a combination of all these 3 levers will be used by governments to dig themselves out of their deficit difficulties. I see inflation being higher than it is today in the future.
So this slide's a visual on the dramatic effect that inflation can have on your purchasing power. It really shows the need to be outpacing inflation, or you may risk eroding your capital in the case of a lengthy retirement. William, can you add to this and explain a little bit about how we work with clients to counteract inflation?
Yes, this is a very important slide. And it really shows why we're concerned about inflation and are always on the lookout, even for modestly higher inflation. The graph shows the gradual and yet the very dramatic fall in purchasing power over this 30-year period of even a relatively modest inflation of 3% and 5%. If we combine this slide that shows the fall in purchasing power that inflation causes with the earlier slide on longevity, which indicates that half of our clients need to fund retirements that will last for 25 years to age 90, and if we add another 5 years longer for those that retire early and possibly even 5 or 10 more years for those that are long-lived, add it all up, we could be looking at a retirement of at least 30 years and possibly longer. What are the implications of inflation? Well, inflation does 3 things. First, as illustrated on this slide, inflation decreases the spending power of your capital. Second, inflation decreases the spending power of your income your capital generates. And thirdly, if your income and your capital increases with inflation, those inflationary increases, not real increases, but those inflationary increases in your income and capital will be taxed, meaning resulting in inflation increasing the tax burden.
And now that we've talked about how long our clients have to look forward to in retirement and the threat of inflation, the triple threat to the real value of capital, to the spending power of income, and of the increased burden of tax, how do we answer the question of how much should I spend?
How much should you spend? How much can you spend in retirement and not risk running out of money? Every situation is unique and depends on a lot of things. Some of the things you can control or at least influence, and other things are totally outside your control. You certainly can't control inflation or tax rates. I guess you can influence, but you certainly can't control how long you're going to live. But you can control to some degree your spending, and you can invest to protect yourselves from inflation, and you can invest to reduce your tax bill so that your investments will last longer and provide sufficient income should you be long-lived. How much you spend also depends on any wishes you have to leave a legacy, either before or after your death. Lots of factors involved in this. This is a quote we picked up and tweeted about a month ago from the Minister of Finance in Japan. The Minister of Finance as much as encouraged long-lived Japanese seniors to hurry up and die because the financial burden they are imposing on the Japanese government. He didn't retract the quote, and in fact, I think the quote reflects the resentment that the younger generation in Japan seems to have against supporting their seniors. I might add, interestingly, that the finance minister himself is 72 years old, but I suppose he doesn't include himself in the long-lived group he wishes would hurry up and die, does he? The takeaway from this presentation, which we've entitled Retirement on Your Terms, is that in Canada, with federal and provincial budget deficits, with elevated debt levels, and with the enormous Social Security and medical entitlement payments queued up for boomer Canadians over the next 20 or 30 years, we might expect intergenerational resentment in our own country, and we may expect entitlements to be clawed back and taxes to be increased. And in order to be able to weather that perfect storm of increasing taxes, reduced entitlements, and increased inflation, and do so with a 30-year retirement, and to enjoy retirement on your terms, it's vitally important to be well invested with an approach that is built to last. This slide shows us how not to invest your portfolio. This is a portfolio that is not built to last, but it's not unlike portfolios that we see of people coming to our office for the first time. Here are the facts in this illustration. What are the factors? Capital of $2 million in this case, which would qualify this person as being one of the 1% in most people's minds. Capital of $2 million. Spending in this situation is seemingly modest, $80,000 a year from the portfolio, modest versus the amount of capital involved. Person's not a spendthrift. Inflation in this case is an elevated 5%, higher than what we've enjoyed in the last 20 years, but not out of the realm of what has been experienced over the past 40 years. And it's a rate that is quite possible in coming years. If we look down the right hand of the slide, spending which starts at $80,000 in year 1, and we look in the 5-year increments going down to year 20, 15 and 20, we see the dramatic impact that the 5% inflation has in increasing the amount of income or cash needed to spend from this portfolio to support this person. The investor here is afraid of the stock market and therefore invests in GICs and bonds. And the interest earned in this case, in this illustration, is 3%. Perhaps we're a bit light here. Perhaps 3% is lower than what it should be. It's certainly higher than what we can earn on bonds today, but it's likely lower than what bond interest rates will be in coming decades and GICs. However, the point of this slide is it's an illustration. It's not to accurately forecast a particular situation, but to starkly illustrate the ravages of inflation. In this situation, you're okay if you're gone in the first 20 years. But if you live past 20 years, and the graph that we showed earlier indicates that a 65-year-old couple has an 80% chance of outliving 20 years of retirement, well, at the end of 20 years, in that illustration, the capital's gone. There's nothing for a legacy and nothing to generate income after year 20. I hope this is a wake-up call to investors who are not properly invested.
And finally, our title slide is How to Live Your Life in Retirement on Your Terms.
Well, if we're to live life on your terms, we clearly have to do better than we just illustrated. This involves protecting your capital and your income against inflation, investing to earn a decent yield in a low interest rate environment, controlling taxes, not spending too much, so that your capital can last you through your retirement. Living life on your terms also means not spending too little in your retirement. There is a delicate balance. And there's little point in having your portfolio grow, but at the end of the day not be able to enjoy the rewards. That's why we endeavor to help our clients live their perfect calendar.
So we will now begin to answer some questions from the chat. And William, the first one I have here is, what about our clients that do not fully retire? So I think this would be regarding the question of how much should I spend?
Yeah, this is becoming more common. Less people are going for a hard stop retirement. More and more people are deciding to slow down and work less, perhaps slowing down earlier than they would otherwise retire. And for many clients, living their perfect calendar means working less so that they can do the things they want to do while they're able to do it, while they have their health. Remember, we need those three things. We need money, we need health, and we need time to live our perfect calendar. So many people want to still be connected with their work. And some clients are forced by job cuts, job loss, to not fully retire but work part-time. By not fully retiring and working longer, it means that income's coming in for longer, and that allows them to delay drawing their cash flow from their portfolio. And it's a great life strategy to live life on your terms, but it's also a great financial strategy to make the capital last longer.
Great. Now, second question I have here is, can you just clarify how inflation increases income taxes?
Well, let me answer that question by giving you an example of two investors. And when I went to university in the 70s, this was widely understood and talked about. You don't hear about, you rarely hear about this these days. But let's talk about two investors. Investor A earns 2% interest, and inflation is 1%. Investor B earns 10% inflation, and inflation is 9%. In both cases, the real after-inflation rate of return is the same, 1%. 2 minus 1 is 1%. 10 minus 9 is 1%. No difference until we introduce taxes. And so, Matt, if we assume a 50% tax rate, just for simplicity, investor A earns 2%, pays 1% tax, gets a haircut of 1% from inflation, and breaks even with a zero after-tax rate of return, after inflation and after tax. But for investor B, after tax and inflation, they get minus 4%. 10 minus 5 for tax, minus 9 for inflation, minus 4. This is how inflation increases tax on income. The same sort of principle applies to capital too, that illusory gains of inflated gains where there's no real gain as well attracts tax and increases your tax rate.
Thanks, William. So if there's no more questions from the chat, thank you for joining us today. And if you would like to discuss today's webinar further, please feel free to contact us at 416-969-3190. Thank you, and I will now be ending the session.